Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting online talk from the Oxford Guild with our Collegium Global Network and our partner societies from leading universities. We're delighted to be hosting the special online discussion today with Daphne Koller, a world-renowned serial entrepreneur, computer scientist, and AI expert who founded the EdTech Coursera, which today is valued at over $2.5 billion. She is co-founder and CEO of Insitro, which focuses on drug discovery by combining AI and biomedicine, and is also co-founder of EdTech engageli. She was also former chief computing officer at Calico Labs, Alphabet's anti-aging focused biotech subsidiary, and has been recognized by many awards around the world, including being named as one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world, Fast Company's most creative people in business, and one of Newsweek's 10 most important people in the world. She's also a computer science professor at Stanford University, and today we'll be discussing some fascinating topical issues around the future of big tech, EdTech, and giving us the inside track into the latest developments in artificial intelligence and biomedicine, as well as answering your questions. So thank you very much again, Daphne, for joining us today and for taking the time to share your insights with us. Let's begin the discussion a bit by talking about your background and your transition from academia to industry, first founding Coursera in 2012. What first induced you to make this move, and what were the most challenging aspects you found in that transition?
So by the time I started Coursera, I'd been at Stanford for close to 18 years, and I think I'd gotten a little bit disillusioned with having an impact metric that really just counted publications as the measure for impact. I wanted to have a more immediate and direct impact on the lives of people. And I tried to do that from within academia and wasn't quite successful in getting technologies, even ones that I thought were quite impactful, that we'd created at Stanford, adopted by industry and actually making their way into the hands of people. And so when our work at Stanford on technology-assisted education came about and really allowed access to education to hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, it was an opportunity that I just couldn't pass up to make an impact and really touch the lives of multiple people. And so at that point, I took what I thought would be a 2-year leave of absence. I thought I would do this for 2 years and then come back to Stanford. But I discovered that it was very addictive, the ability to actually build something and have whatever it is that you're building be something that people actually use and benefit from. And so that was, to me, it was very difficult for me to come back from that.
Definitely, and obviously EdTech right now is an area that's had a lot of focus and attention on it, given the pandemic. What do you see being the most exciting developments you've observed so far in the EdTech space?
So I think that there's two threads that are very transformative. One is the growing self-education that people do at home using online content as a path towards increasing their hireability, their job skills in job categories that they might not otherwise have had access to. I think that many people are currently out of work or working at least or working from home most of the time, and that gives them an opportunity to expand their knowledge. The other thing that I think, and of course Coursera really leans into that trend and is an incredible opportunity for people to benefit from some high quality educational resources, which is why I've been able to see some of those numbers and see how huge the impact of that has been. The second thing that we're seeing is that many of our students are currently both at the elementary, high school level, but also at the college level, are now studying at home versus face-to-face. And this is a mode of education where it's traditionally been very challenging for people to be successful. They become very quickly disengaged. I saw that with my own 2 daughters, and they're both academic, pretty high performers. And when they started quote unquote Zoom school in the spring of last academic year, we saw one of them, after spending the requisite 2 minutes convincing the instructor that she was online, spending the rest of her time perfecting her Sims game, and the other one making her way through the Netflix catalog. And neither of those were particularly valuable educational experiences. And so what we really need is to, as we move to an online format, find a way to create a much more engaging, interactive learning experience. And what I think we'll see as we emerge from this pandemic, hopefully at some point, we'll be able to migrate some of those concepts that we had to develop in the pandemic times into a new way of teaching, even for situations where we don't have to teach entirely online, because frankly, a large lecture classroom is not super engaging either. And can we take some of the lessons that we learned from this online setting and bring that into how we teach our students even afterwards? I think that would be a really interesting opportunity for us.
Definitely. And can you tell us a bit more about your latest work and how you came to become interested in the intersection of machine learning and biology and the work at Insitro?
So my interest in this actually predates the work that I'm currently doing at Insitro. A lot of people ask me the question, well, why are you suddenly interested in biology after a career's worth of machine learning? What is actually the case is that I started to work on machine learning applied to biomedical data sets very early in my career. So I joined the faculty at Stanford in 95 as what is really the first machine learning hire, and then became not quite excited about the kinds of data sets that were available at the time to do machine learning research. They were relatively simplistic, but more importantly, they were uninspiring. Like, can you categorize articles into from a news group into one category or another? And like, how useful is that? And how inspirational is that? And so I started to work on biomedical data sets around 99, 2000, when the first ways of measuring biology quantitatively in a reasonably scalable way started to emerge, like microarray data sets or the first human genome. And over time, I became more and more interested in the biology itself, but also increasingly frustrated at the quality and availability of data sets that were available to really extract biological insight using machine learning techniques, because a lot of the data sets were rather poor quality, but more importantly, they weren't designed to purpose. That is, you were kind of taking a data set that had been designed to validate some biological hypothesis, and then using that as a starting point for discovery, often on a completely different problem, and it wasn't a great fit. And so for me, the motivation for Insitro and what makes me so excited about what we're doing is that we're finally in a world where two transformative threads have converged and are enabling at the same time. One of them is, of course, the remarkable progress that we've seen in machine learning over the past decade or so, where problems that would have been thought impossible even 5 or 10 years ago are now considered run-of-the-mill across multiple areas of human inquiry. And the other is the availability of an increasing set of tools that bioengineers and cell biologists and others have developed that allow us to create biological data sets in a completely new way. And those involve things like CRISPR that allows us in an incredibly scalable way to intervene at different genes in the cells, silencing them or activating them. The ability to do that in cellular models that are increasingly closer and closer to real human biology, measuring cells across multiple different readouts that are incredibly powerful and contain tremendous amounts of information about the underlying biology. So you kind of put those two threads together, you have the ability to generate massive biological data sets that are fit to purpose, combined with the tools that you have for machine learning to interpret those. And that really provides us with incredible insights on human disease, and potentially with the starting point for targets that might help us ameliorate those diseases.
Fantastic. And let's move on to the issue of diversity in the tech industry. So you're a great source of inspiration for many as a woman who's reached the very top of a traditionally male-dominated field. What are some of the greatest challenges you faced and lessons you learned from that?
Yeah, so this is a, there's many stories out there in the media. Some are particularly egregious about women who have suffered way more than I have episodes of genuine sexual harassment, even sexual assault. I'm in the fortunate position of not having been on the receiving end of treatment that is that egregious. But at the same time, what the media hasn't focused as much attention on is the death by 1,000 cuts, which I think is very ubiquitous, and most women who are professionals, and certainly in male-dominated fields, are almost oblivious to, because they're just so commonplace. And it includes things like where you go into a professional meeting and the person on the other side immediately assumes that because you're a woman, you are the more junior person or even the administrative assistant. I'm one example of that I remember particularly as a particularly pointed one is when I was introduced, this was during my Coursera days, to a CEO of a Fortune 50 company, and I was clearly introduced as, the co-founder and co-CEO of Coursera, and I responded saying, sounds great, would love to meet up and talk about ways we could work together. And the response from and I said, my assistant James would be happy to coordinate, and his assistant responded saying, dear Daphne, could you please confirm James's availability for a meeting with our CEO on this and that date? And it was clear from the thread that this was the wrong interpretation, but just the default assumption was so strong that she immediately gravitated to that. And that's just one example. There's dozens of these, if not more, that I could refer back to. The many times in which, and I think this again happens to a lot of women, where you're in a meeting and you're the only woman in the room with 10 guys around the table, and you say something and no one really pays attention. The conversation moves on. 5 minutes later, a guy says the exact same thing. It's like, John, what a great idea. Let's talk about that. And you just kind of have to figure out how to navigate that. And there's not a great solution to this.
Definitely. And what advice would you give to young women who are looking to follow a similar path to you and break into the tech industry?
So first of all, I'm going to give advice to young women, but I'm also going to give advice to men in a second, because I think that's important as well. So advice to young women is, don't let it get to you. You will face this type of situation. You need to stand up for yourself. You need to find ways that are constructive but at the same time effective. So for instance, for the situation that I just mentioned with the people around the table, one way that I think can work is to say something, thank you, John, for expanding on the point that I made. And yeah, I think you added this additional insight, and that is a way of highlighting in a subtle way the fact that you made that contribution earlier. But let me add that it's a challenge for a woman to do that for herself, because even in this most subtle way, it comes across as being sort of grabby for attention, and that especially for a woman is often viewed as an undesirable attribute. So what I would try to encourage all of you who are listening to this, women as well as men, is when you see this happening, when you see around you someone whose contributions are being diminished because of their gender or because of their ethnicity or for any reason, it's much more effective if you stand up for them and call out the fact that they were the ones who had that idea, or that they're not the administrative assistant or whatever. It's much more effective for you to do that than it is for them to do that. And so I would say this is not a women problem or a minority problem. It's an all of us problem, and all of us should participate in trying to come up with solutions and really encouraging everyone around us to be conscious about those implicit biases and try and address them.
Absolutely. So moving on to the topic of AI, it's a technology that's being widely applied to solve many problems across many different industries today. What key mistakes have you seen other AI-focused companies make that you hope to avoid with your latest ventures?
So I'm going to focus on machine learning rather than AI, because that's how I would actually categorize my work. And I think those are often confused for each other, AI and machine learning, but I think they're somewhat different from each other. The main mistake that I've seen people make, actually with both AI and ML, is first of all thinking that it's the silver bullet that's going to solve all problems, and you just sprinkle enough of it on top of what you're doing and magically great things will happen. The critical question for any company looking to engage in those technologies is, first of all, what is the problem that you're looking to solve? And is the tool that you're applying, be it whatever it is within the AI or ML space, really the right tool for the job? And problem selection is really the most critical aspect of success in deploying, I would say, of pretty much any new technology, but especially these ones. On machine learning specifically, I think the thing that people sometimes neglect is the garbage in, garbage out aspect of machine learning, and the fact that if you feed bad data to a machine learning algorithm, it could actually end up being worse than the solution you had to begin with, because machine learning will latch onto and amplify any artifacts and issues that your data set has, often in ways that will be really hard to detect. And so you really want to be very conscious of what data you're feeding and make sure that you are testing your algorithm in a way that will be reflective of how it would be used in the field, so that you're convinced in a way that is less likely to be confounded by some artifacts in the data that your algorithm is actually going to work. And really spend a lot of time on ensuring data quality and data relevance to the problem that you're looking to solve. Because given the choice between a great data set and a mediocre machine learning algorithm versus a crappy data set and a great machine learning algorithm, I would take the first any day. I mean, obviously a great data set and a great machine learning algorithm is the best of both worlds, but data quality is paramount here. So to your question of my latest ventures, in Insitro, we have placed a huge emphasis on building up an internal wet lab capability that generates very high quality data that's fit to purpose and at the right scale. And so we have this factory that generates cells, perturbs cells, measures cells, all via robotic infrastructure with incredible collection of metadata and very controlled environments, just so that we can get the best data quality that we can possibly hope to. And I think, and then also we have multiple ways that computationally we then test for the quality of the conclusions and ensure that we're really learning something that is meaningful. One of the things that I'm really excited about engageli, although it's early days for us, is that it's an instrumented platform that really allows interaction between instructors and students, as well as between students and other students using peer learning. And as such, it allows the collection of data around those interactions and allows you to test interventions that might improve the student success. And so you can actually ask the question, for instance, if you put students in a study group with other students of a comparable level, is that better than having a broader distribution of levels in the study group with the more sophisticated students, the ones that are further ahead, helping the other ones along? No one knows the answer to that question because we haven't had enough ability to collect the data to actually answer that question. And so I think one of the really exciting aspects of having a data-rich environment for education is that we can finally have enough data to really think scientifically in a data-driven way about education science.
And there's been a lot of debate currently about the ethics of both AI and ML and fears for the future around whether it's a force for good or something that can be used in more nefarious purposes. What's your view on this? And what do you feel are the limitations of ML and where does it clearly not work well?
So first of all, I think it's important to understand where the ethical problems with AI and ML really lie and where I think we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. So in terms of being worried. So there's a bunch of people out there who are sounding warning bells about machines taking over the world and, conscious robots, kind of like in Terminator, trying to kill off humanity. We are so far away from robots or machines that have any kind of consciousness and are able to sort of maliciously, malevolently engage against people. Where I think the ethics of AI and ML really do deserve some thought is, first of all, I think in the job losses that will emerge as they have in any new technology, where machines have taken over jobs in the Industrial Revolution and in the Agricultural Revolution, and now they're taking jobs that have been thought to be relatively safe, white-collar jobs, knowledge worker jobs. And what do we do with all of the people who are going to be displaced, and can we find a new category of jobs for them? And I think those questions are well worth thinking about. And some people will tell you this is the same as these other revolutions. New job categories will emerge and there will be at least as much employment as there was before. And other people who make an equally compelling case that this one's different. I don't know what the answer is on that one. I think there's valid arguments on both sides, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's a question that's well worth considering. The other, I think, a second important ethical question on AI and ML is on data quality and the fact that the machine learning algorithms are able to pick up and, in fact, amplify biases that exist in the data. And we've seen some pretty horrendous examples of machines that have picked up on, certain racial biases, gender biases, amplified them and fed them back in search queries and such. And being really thoughtful about testing for those things is, I think, critical and a valuable lesson learned that the community really needs to be working on in terms of how to make sure that that doesn't happen, that the worst side of us as humans is amplified by the machines. And then I think the last big ethical question, I guess there's more, but another one is just, we're building really complex systems now that have a lot of that we don't really understand, because they are, in order to maximize performance, the system needs to become more and more complex. And once you're building something that you don't understand, it creates an opportunity for both inadvertent as well as malicious behavior by people to kind of intervene in those systems and create catastrophic outcomes in things like stock markets, power grids, hospital systems, and so on, that are, in some cases, even inadvertently could be really catastrophic in their outcomes. So how do we protect those systems and avoid when you really don't exactly understand what's going on underneath the hood? And I think there's a lot of questions like that that deserve attention much more than will robots take over the universe.
Picking up on that point around biases, when building a discovery platform like Insitro, where you use human data, how will you avoid bias in building your platform to ensure that you're able to discover and develop drugs that work in the wider general population?
No, I think that is a really important question, and one that we've spent a fair bit of time thinking about, but I don't think we have a full answer. So the issue with a discovery platform that's based on human data is that you're in some sense at the mercy of the human data that has been collected, and at least in the context of human genetics, that up until now has been largely in European cohorts. And so there's definitely a European-centric aspect to all of the discovery that's happening right now in biology, because there just aren't enough data to go available for many other ethnic backgrounds. And so I think the question is, what impact does that have and how does one address it? So one argument, which may be true, is to say, look, you can use, even if you use Europeans as the discovery set, it doesn't mean that the drugs that you end up developing won't work for other populations. Ultimately, biology is biology, and while specific variants that are disease causing might be more predominant in some populations than others, it's often the same genes and certainly the same pathways, and so you may well end up in a world where your drug works well for pretty much, or at least in a way that is not specific to a particular ethnic background. It might be specific to a particular genotype, but not to a specific ethnic background. I think that's the good scenario. That's certainly the one we hope will emerge from our work. One of the commitments that we've made ourselves is that we will at least, and we will ask the question. That is, we won't blithely assume that a drug that was developed with European data also works for people with Asian or African ancestry. And so we can go back and validate in some of the data sets from other ethnic backgrounds and at least convince ourselves whether the drug we develop does or doesn't work. If the answer is that it doesn't work, which is definitely possible, then that immediately helps us find the beginnings of the scientific thread in understanding, okay, if it doesn't work, why does it not work? And then what would it take to make a drug that does work? I think the real failure comes up when you don't even ask the question and just assume that everyone is just like Europeans.
That's really fascinating to hear about. Why do you feel that now is the right time to apply machine learning methods to biopharma and biomedicine?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers to that coming from the two opposite sides. One is the need and the other is the opportunity. Mm-hmm. On the need, we've made tremendous strides in drug discovery and development, but at the same time, there is this ongoing phenomenon called Irum's law. Irum, if you look at the word, it's the inverse of Moore's law. Moore's law, of course, being the exponential increase in productivity of technology because of the increase in compute power per area of a silicon chip. The Irum's law is the inverse trend, which is an exponential decrease in productivity of pharmaceutical R&D, in which the number of drugs developed and approved per billion US dollars has been decreasing exponentially year on year for 70 years. So I think there is an important, and I think that's because the biologies that we're tackling are increasingly complex, and the standard of care to beat is becoming increasingly high. And so if we really need to make drugs for some of those diseases, especially, for instance, diseases of the neuroscience, where it's the brain is such a complex organ, and disentangling interventions that could actually be beneficial is incredibly challenging. So I think we really do need to have a different way of discovering drugs. On the other side, which is the opportunity side, are these trends that I alluded to earlier in our conversation, in which cell biologists and bioengineers have actually developed a set of tools that really allow massive amounts of data to be generated at scale. And when you combine that with the ongoing collection of and characterization of large human cohorts, like in the UK Biobank, which, by the way, is one of my favorite data sets of all time, I think it's an incredible opportunity to take data creation and data analysis and put them together and really extract novel biological insights and help address Irum's law.
And which parts of the drug development process or specific disease areas do you feel the most amenable to machine learning today? What kind of applications do you think are actionable today?
So I think it's there are multiple opportunities all the way across the pharma R&D value chain. If you start out from the earlier stages, which is where we began our journey, then you'll find that the biological discovery effort, which is understanding the biologies, understanding which targets are actually going to meaningfully modulate disease, I think that's a huge opportunity. We've recently moved one step beyond that into, okay, fine, we now have a target. You need to modulate that target. How do you do that? And how do you design a drug that has the right mechanism of action and doesn't have undesired side effects? I think that's another area where machine learning can be applied. But then there's multiple additional ones down the line. So for instance, as you go into a clinical trial, if you could actually identify the correct patient segment that's going to benefit from your drug and focus your trial and subsequently, assuming approval, your therapeutic intervention on the people who would benefit, you would be much more successful because you could really help the people who can be helped without exposing a whole bunch of other people to unnecessary side effects and potentially eliminating their use of a different drug that might actually help them. So selection of patients is a huge area where I think you could use machine learning. And then especially in the clinical trial stage, but also I think potentially downstream, even in clinical use and practice, we currently have very poor ways of tracking patient outcome and identifying whether patients are or are not benefiting from a drug. So if you think about some of the, for instance, processes by which we test patient progression in dementia, you have a patient coming into the doctor's office and the doctor asking questions like, how do you feel today? Do you feel like your memory is as good or worse than it was when you last visited me? This is such a biased and subjective way of tracking disease progression. It's a very artificial setting for the patient, often high stress. They often want to look good for their doctor, for themselves, so they have an incentive to stretch the truth a little bit. It's just a terrible way of measuring disease progression. If you had something that was much more tied to the patient's actual ability to function in their day-to-day life, I think that would be a much better way of tracking disease progression. But that's not something that we currently do. So I think, as I said, all the way from the biology through the drug design, through the patient selection and down to tracking progression, I think there's opportunities for better analytical tools to be employed, and ones that are based on data collection and machine learning.
And at Insitro, you've been focusing on building a platform that combines human genetics, stem cells, functional genomics, and machine learning. Which diseases do you feel are most amenable to the approach Insitro is taking, and which ones are less appropriate?
Right. So we have focused on diseases that have a strong genetic basis because we're using a very human genetics-oriented discovery strategy. So if you have a disease that's really driven entirely by environmental factors and ones that we can't really recreate in a lab environment, that's ones where our approach wouldn't really work very well. So that's one criterion that we employ. A second criterion that we employ is diseases where the cellular models that we're using in the lab are mature and robust. So for instance, it turns out to be surprisingly easy to turn a stem cell into a neuron, so that you could do experiments in neurons that look like maybe not super mature, but real neurons. Other cell types are much more, some other cell types are much more challenging to work with, and so we pick. So that's another aspect. The third one that we look at is, to what extent can you capture enough of the biology of the disease in these relatively restricted cellular systems that we work with. So you can currently make, for instance, a co-culture of a couple of cell types. For certain types of body systems, organs, you can make what are called organoids, which are little micro organs. So for instance, you can make micro brains or micro livers, which recapitulate multiple cell types in a small system. So if the disease is encapsulated, or large parts of it are encapsulated within such a system, then you can learn a lot about the disease by examining data that's produced in the lab. If the disease is really complex and systemic and sort of involves multiple factors that interact, it becomes very, very challenging to create an in vitro system that really recapitulates the biology of the disease. So a great example of that, and very timely, is the response of the adaptive immune system to, for instance, a viral pathogen like SARS-CoV-2, where there's certain aspects certainly that one can capture in the lab in terms of the response of a cell when it's infected by a virus, and that's something that you could look at and learn a lot about in the lab. But when you then say, okay, what happens not in the immediate acute response to the disease, but in some of those cases where we see where 2, 3, 4 weeks after the disease, suddenly the immune system begins to take a surprising trajectory, and there's an adaptive immune response that is systemic and creates havoc in the body. That's very hard to capture in an in vitro system, because it involves so many different cell types across the body. There's other diseases like that are highly systemic, and those are probably not the ones that we would go after at this point.
It's really interesting to hear. Before we go into audience questions, we've had a lot come through. Let's ask one final one around company building and culture. So you've described yourself as bilingual, which is fluent both in the language of biotech and machine learning. How do you find and recruit like-minded people? What do you look for and what do you look at most?
So I think that building culture is something that anyone building a company ought to be thinking about very carefully and deliberately from day one. It's one of those things that oftentimes first-time entrepreneurs, first-time founders think, oh, culture will develop organically, or sometimes they don't even think about culture at all because they've never really had to deal with it. And I think it's one of those things that is absolutely critical in the design of a company to make sure you set this up right from the start. For us, given the type of company that we're looking to build, where there is an equal importance on the data that is generated and making sure that it is the right data and fit to purpose for machine learning, and on the analytical methods, and on then making sure that this thing all feeds into drugs that actually make a difference to patients, you really need to create a culture where people from these very diverse backgrounds are working together as equal partners. And we can't have a culture, which is quite common in many other companies and also organizations, of either an ascendancy of one group over the other, where in most biopharma companies, you have the scientists setting the strategy direction and the bioinformatics team kind of sitting there in the back room being, data being thrown at them over the wall saying, please analyze this for me. And they don't really have a seat at the table. Nor, by the way, do we like the other model, which is one that we see in a lot of tech-oriented companies where, those doctors, those biologists, we don't really need them very much. They can be consultants or whatever, but we engineers, computer scientists, we know what we need to do. That is equally flawed, in my opinion. And so you really need a culture where people with very different backgrounds and types of expertise come together and think of themselves as equal partners. And because it's very rare to find people who really are experts in everything, I'm not an expert in everything for sure, it's important that people come in with a certain humility and spirit of collaboration and feeling like they are partners for the journey. And so we have a behavioral norm, which I think is absolutely critical, which is we engage with each other openly, constructively, and with respect. And openness means you need to be open to asking silly questions and to accepting other people's naive ideas as potentially being quite useful, because maybe their orthogonal mindset actually is revealing something that you wouldn't have thought about, but is a really good idea. And so that, combined with the respect that we have for the expertise that each and every person on the team brings to the table, and that each of us is an important partner in this journey that we're on. And so I was, I think, very successful in hiring an early team that all agrees with these norms and lives by them. And once you have that culture going, then it tends to self-reinforce because people self-select. If someone is of the opinion that they want to be the most important person because their discipline is most important, they're not going to come to Insitro. And if they somehow make their way through the door, we're probably not going to want to hire them because they just, that's not the culture that we're looking to build. And I think it's really important for every organization to have its own unique culture, whatever it is that you think is appropriate for the kind of company you're trying to build, and really be deliberate about building that.
Thanks so much, Daphne, for answering all of our questions. It's been brilliant. Thought now would be a good time to open it up to the audience, as we've had quite a lot of questions coming in and quite a lot of interest also. Probably a good one to begin with would be Paul, who's doing biology at Oxford. And Paul has asked, do you think online programs can be considered on par with in-person qualifications? Will they ever get to that stage, maybe if the trends with the pandemic continue?
So I actually think that whether a program is online or not is not a mark of its quality. And some of the programs that we have been able to build at Coursera with our university partners have been online, and they have been exceptionally high quality. What I think you really need to think about is the quality of the instruction and the curriculum, and equally, or even more importantly, the quality of the engagement that you create between the instructor and the students, and between the students and other students. And I think that's a place where it's definitely more challenging to do that in a virtual world. But to your point, Paul, the pandemic has forced us to expand our thinking about what kind of interactions are possible to do in an online format. There's people who would have told us before the pandemic that you will never hire a person that you have not met face to face, and now everyone does that. There's people who said they will never fund a company, investors who said they will never fund a company unless they get to meet the management team face to face, and now everyone does that on a regular basis. So I think that as we as we shed some of those constraints on our thinking on the one hand, and as we tools like engageli, for instance, is trying to do, so that people have a more natural way of interacting with each other, even on a 2D screen, I think that we will have that quality of engagement, and that will create a much improved, I would say, experience in these online programs. So it's not about the quality, but I think the experience is definitely going to improve as a result of the pandemic.
Okay, brilliant. Next one, question about the tech sector in general, a bit broader. This comes from Jane, who's doing law at Cambridge. And Jane has asked, how active a role do you think that the state should play in supporting the growth of the tech sector?
Yeah, so honestly, I think the most important thing a government can do in encouraging industrial growth is to largely stay out of the way. And I mean, obviously within reason, you want to make sure that the law and environmental guidelines and so on and so forth, but I don't know that you need that much encouragement. What I think a government ought to do is continue supporting the basic science that has driven the development of so many of the ideas that underlie not just tech, but a lot of other sectors as well. So I think that that's a place where there's people who say, well, given the importance of, given the kind of value that tech companies have, maybe we don't need to support academic basic research because the funding will come from industry. That has not generally proven to be true. And some of the most impactful ideas that have transformed our world have originated from basic science that had nothing to do with industrial needs. And that includes ideas that go back to, early cryptography, which came from number theory, which is an incredibly, in principle, obscure mathematical discipline, all the way to the discovery of the CRISPR-Cas system, which was done when people were studying bacterial defense mechanisms against pathogens. And it's just an amazing thing that gave rise to what are some of the most fundamentally transformative tools for research, for diagnostics, and for potentially therapeutics as well. And so government can really intervene in this ecosystem, but making sure that basic science, that serendipitous discovery, continues to be supported.
Okay, sorry about that. Next question here, it's come from Seb, who's doing maths at Imperial. And Seb has asked, sorry, I think it's a slight problem with my connection. Seb has asked, what do you think is, okay, sure.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, Seb, and one that I've encountered with daughters as well, which is, how does one encourage young people to become more interested in science? And I think that that's a place where we as a community can really play a significant role. I mean, certainly there's a lot of resources already out there online in terms of, science videos and things like that give people kind of like the teasers about some of the scientific topics that are out there, and obviously having more of those is great. But a place that I think is lacking is in ways in which young people can engage in the science directly themselves, hands-on, because we all know that the most valuable way to get excited about something is by actually doing it yourself rather than just watching videos about it. And so when I was, for instance, looking for my daughters as a way of what scientific data sets can they, or what scientific experiments, data sets and so on, can they potentially engage in, there's not a lot of do-it-yourself resources for things that people can do that are meaningful. So not like baby experiments, but also not at the level of what you would expect of an adult. So for instance, when my daughter was learning to program and I was interested in machine learning, I said, why don't you go look at the Kaggle competitions, which is this website that has a bunch of data sets with competitions and who can perform better at them. And that's a great resource, but it's dominated by, adult programmers who are really looking at that as a way of enhancing their credentials and showing that they're like the best competitor in Kaggle and such. And so for a 14-year-old looking to program, they're so far down in the rankings that it becomes demotivating. Similarly, there's not a lot of science kits for older teens that are not the kind where you just do a little bit of chemistry with cornstarch and whatever, but really something that is a more interesting scientific kit where you could do something that is more meaningful as an experiment, but not at the level of what you would expect of an adult, grad student. So I think creating more resources like that would be super helpful.
Okay, and next question is from Ananya, who's doing biology at Warwick. Ananya has asked, why do you think it is that such a relatively small group of investors feature in so many of the big tech successes in recent years?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ananya, and I would say partly it's because success feeds on success, and if you have, and that's true in life in general, not just in investment, when you have someone who has been successful in the past, they tend to get the best set of entrepreneurs wanting to come work with them again, and so that they get better deal flow. There's also at the same time a certain halo on, especially for investors that have been successful multiple times, where there gets to be a certain self-reinforcement almost, where if you are anointed, so to speak, by having an investment from a top investment firm, then that opens doors to potential customers, to the next round of investors. So you tend to be better capitalized. You tend to get better employees, because if you have been anointed by one of those top firms, then maybe that means you're a better company, so I'm more likely to want to go work for you if I'm top talent. And so it's just, there's also that feedback loop, the positive feedback loop for the companies that also tends to make them more successful. So I think it's I think there is part of that, and then I think genuinely there are some investors who have a good nose for areas where there's good high impact companies to be made and have a good eye for talent. And so there is also some selection on the part of the investors themselves, where they are maybe not just lucky, but also better. But I think, like I said, a lot of it is that self-reinforcement, which, by the way, also holds for academic institutions, right? Why are people to come out from top academic institutions more successful in life in many cases than people to come out from institutions that are lower ranked? It's partly because maybe there's a selection of of having more talented people at these institutions to begin with, but there's some incredibly talented people at lower ranked universities, but they don't have the halo effect of having gone to, top university. So I think it's not that dissimilar.
Brilliant. Next question is from Ash, who's doing an MBA at Harvard. And Ash has asked, how convinced are you by the proposed effectiveness of mass rapid testing in defeating COVID-19?
Well, let me start from the end and say that defeating is a very broad word and not one that I would use lightly. I think in the same way that COVID-19 is a very wily and complex beast, and we're going to need multiple pieces, including vaccines, including social distancing and masks and a lot of other things. But I actually believe that mass rapid testing could be a very significant component in that battle. And I think if we could more early detect people who are infected and ask them to stay at home, that will hugely reduce the number of infected asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people walking around there infecting others. This is particularly the case for the younger people who are often asymptomatic and yet go around there spreading the disease. So if we could have something that was quick, even if it wasn't as accurate as the most complex PCR-based tests, but was quick, reasonably accurate, and you could get the results, you could do the test at home and get the results in 15 minutes, I think it would be hugely transformative to this.
Okay, another question about Silicon Valley from Wei, who's doing PP at the LSE. And Wei has asked, why do you think Silicon Valley has been able to establish itself as the global hub of tech? And what is the reason for so much consistent success in the creation of spin-outs from Stanford?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Wei, and I think has, again, multiple pieces. Part of that is, again, the selection bias of Stanford tending to attract, because of the successes that have emerged from the Stanford ecosystem at the early stages, the early of Silicon Valley, it tends to attract people who are interested in tech, are more entrepreneurial in mindset, and they come there, and so that again feeds that feedback loop that I talked about. I think there are also, again, that feedback loop expands beyond that in the sense of, because there's so much of that entrepreneurial activity going on, there's more investor presence in Silicon Valley, so there's more sources of capital to be had. There's also a greater collection of talent, which I think is hugely important. I mean, if you're setting up a tech company in a town somewhere and there isn't a whole bunch of other companies around you that are also in the same space, where are you going to draw your more experienced people from? Are you going to always be at the mercy of asking someone to relocate from another part of the country? So the ecosystem effect is, in terms of talent acquisition, is, I think, a huge contributor to the success of Silicon Valley.
Brilliant. And question from Tamar, who's doing biomedical engineering at UCL. Tamar's asked, what key factors do you think make a company culture conducive to success?
Well, so first of all, let me say that different companies are very different, and in some cases legitimately have different needs in terms of what they need to be successful. And I think companies can be successful in different ways, in the way that people can be successful in different ways. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all recipe. One thing that I find to be important in today's environment is there's the breadth of knowledge that is required to make many companies successful is increasing rapidly, and one needs a much broader skill set to be a successful company. And the only way to really do that effectively is not to centralize all of the decision making and all of the thinking in the hands of a small number of people, because no matter how smart they are, there's only so much that they can know. And so I believe strongly that creating a culture that has a level of transparency, a level of anti-hierarchy, in the sense that people who are close to the work and engaged with the day-to-day are empowered to make decisions, bring up ideas, and it's a meritocracy of ideas rather than who's the highest paid person in the room, I think is really important for a successful culture. But again, that's my opinion. There's successful companies that don't do that, and over time, I think that the view that we're trying to follow, the path we're trying to follow, will increasingly dominate. But it's not, like I said, you can be successful in many ways.
Brilliant. Question from Rahul, who's doing economics at Edinburgh. And Rahul has asked, what advice would you give people interested in a career in tech, but who are unsure which angle from which to start off in the industry? Would you recommend one of the giants over a startup?
I probably wouldn't, actually, and for the following reason. I guess, okay, you know what, it's a complicated question. I'm going to give the pros and cons, which may not give you a definitive answer. But one of the things that you can do in a giant is you go into work in one role, and then because of the breadth of areas that exist, you can migrate from one job to the other. And if you started Google working in search, you can then move to working on maps, and you can from there work on whatever on YouTube, and it's relatively easy to do that within a single company. The other side of that is that when you're working at a small company, you really get to have visibility into the entire end-to-end process of what the company does. And so even though in many cases the scope is more limited than it would be at a place like Google, you really get to understand how an idea makes its way from the conception through to the execution, all the way through to whatever sales and marketing, and that you're not going to get to see at one of the giants. So I guess they offer different trade-offs, and partly depends on when you have uncertainty around the trajectory for your career, is that uncertainty about, am I more interested in video applications or in text applications, which you'd be able to explore at Google, or am I more interested in different aspects of what it takes to build a company and the more entrepreneurial questions?
Okay, question from Emily, who's doing geography at KCL, who has asked, if you aren't entrepreneurially minded while still at university, will you ever be? And so second one, what advice do you have from your transition from academia into the startup world?
So Emily, I will tell you that I wasn't particularly entrepreneurially minded when I was at university. In fact, even when I was a faculty member, my husband, who was a serial entrepreneur, and I used to joke that I had the academic side and he had the business side. And so the answer is yes, you can make that transition much later in your career. You do not need to be entrepreneurially minded while at university. What I do think you need to have, and I would encourage all of us to develop, is the willingness to sort of embrace challenges that are outside our comfort zone, and really be willing to say, okay, I don't know anything about this, and I'm willing to just dive in and learn and be a little bit naive and stupid at the beginning because I'm out of my comfort zone. But that, I think, that risk-taking mindset, I think is important to develop relatively early, because it's what's needed to be a successful entrepreneur. But I think it's equally important in being a successful scientist and saying, you know what, I have no idea about this problem, but I think that the perspective that I bring could potentially provide value. So I'm just going to dive in and learn and see what I can do. And so maybe that actually segues nicely into the advice that I would have in transitioning from academia into the startup world, is be willing to embrace risk, be willing to admit that you don't know certain things and that there's a lot for you to learn, and make sure that as you make that transition, you're building a team of people that complements areas in which you have less experience, so that together the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And one of the mistakes that I think I made in the early days of Coursera was that we didn't bring in a lot of people with experience on the business side. We kind of had this like little founding team of ex-Stanford folks. I think, all of us were smart in our academic ways, but none of us had real business experience. And I think we would have had a smoother journey in the early days if we'd had someone who was more experienced in the parts that we didn't know. So I guess that's one thing I would say is, especially when you're venturing into unfamiliar territory to you, do it in partnership with someone else or other people, because you will definitely benefit from that.
Amazing. Okay, question from Abby, who's doing natural sciences at Cambridge. The question is, Insitro has managed to attract a number of stellar institutional investors, from Andreessen Horowitz to Third Rock, GV and BlackRock, and more. What has been the main appeal for them?
So I think it was a combination of a few factors. First is there is a growing recognition, I think, that this area that we're in, which is this confluence of natural sciences and machine learning, data science, is really an area that's going to be incredibly important over the coming 20 years. And I've spoken in talks that I've given about epochs of science and how in different times of history there has been disciplines that have really sort of taken off dramatically in a short period of time because of a new configuration of technologies that have come together. So for instance, in the late 1800s, it was chemistry because we discovered the periodic table. So I think the next big area is what I'm calling digital biology, which is measuring biology in unprecedented ways and scale, interpreting what we measure, and then engineering biology to be doing something different. And so that, so I think that the interest in the area and conviction around the area was a big part of it. I think a second aspect was the recognition that if you really wanted to build something like this, you needed the right type of expertise and this bilinguality, I guess, that I mentioned. And so that while there's a lot of entrance into the space, there's not a lot that can credibly claim that type of expertise. And I think that that was something that they saw at Insitro as well, is that we had the track record to build that kind of really unifying culture that spans those disciplines.
Okay, brilliant. Growing somewhat conscious of time, of course, you've been so generous with it already. Do you think maybe you have time for 3 more questions?
Yes, I think so. I have a hard stop at 11:15, but my time. So we have, I guess, 9 minutes.
Okay, sure. Let's make that 2 then. Question from Ben, who's doing maths at Oxford, and it's about Israel. And Ben has asked, what do you think it is about Israel that makes its tech sector so exciting and vibrant? Can other countries replicate it?
So I think that actually relates to the question that I had that occurred before about what makes Silicon Valley such a place. And I think in Israel, interestingly, the catalyst is ironically enough, the Israeli military. So for those of you who don't know, the Israeli military is a mandatory conscription. Everyone goes, and everyone goes usually at 18 or maybe in early 20s if they do college before the military, which means it's a very egalitarian military and one where young people are given tremendous amounts of responsibility. And so a lot of grads quote unquote from the Israeli top units have a tremendous amount of sort of leadership skills that they've developed as part of their military service, and also the ability to really interact effectively with people from all walks of life, because it is a people's army. And so I think that makes the Israeli tech sector in some ways unique because of that leadership opportunity that it gives to so many young people. Can other countries replicate it? Replicate again. I mean, people have tried to replicate Silicon Valley, and it's not an exact replica, but there are other sort of hubs that have been successful. There's one in Boston. There's one in the Research Triangle in North Carolina. So I think it's possible to create tech ecosystems that are successful based on other premises, but I wouldn't call it replicating.
Okay, brilliant. Thought this might be a nice one to end on here from Rachel, who's doing E&M at Oxford. And Rachel says, thank you for being such an inspiration. As a role model to many of us, I would love to know who were some of your role models or people who you looked up to when growing up.
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I've been asked that question many times, and it's hard for me to point to a single person, because I think I've learned from a lot of people over time, and who I am is sort of like the combination of what I've learned from all these different bits and pieces. And so I can point to specific pieces of who I am that I can attribute more to one person versus another. So for instance, my PhD advisor was a very critical and incisive thinker, and I learned from him how to really decompose a problem into its constituents and think rigorously about each of them. So I think that was a critical thing I learned from him. I learned from my postdoc advisor, who asked me when I first began my postdoc. I was very theoretical up until that point, and he said, well, you've done some really incredible mathematical work, and how would you, if I gave you a team of programmers to implement the ideas that you developed in your PhD, what would you have them do? And I was like, I have no idea. It's so mathematical and abstract. It doesn't really give a lot of opportunities for actual implementation and making an impact. And I think in some ways he helped set me on my journey towards caring more and more over time about the impact that my work has on the lives of people everywhere. And again, I can point to different people that I've had interactions with over time that each of them have taught me something. So when I did my sabbatical with in a biology lab at UCSF with my strong collaborator, I learned just how intricate and sophisticated biological experimentation can be, and just how powerful it is to design data that asks the right question in the right way. So I would say one of the lessons that I've learned is that it's important to go through life learning from everybody, because most people will have something to teach you.
Well, thank you so much for that on that note, Daphne, for sharing so much of your time and your fascinating insights and advice with us, as well as more around your latest exciting ventures that we'll all be following very closely. Thank you also to everyone watching for your varied questions, and we look forward to welcoming you all again soon at our upcoming events. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.